Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Moran. I'm with the All Hazards Consortium. It's our pleasure to host this healthcare sector supply chain webinar looking at supply chain resiliency within the healthcare sector. Should be a great webinar, and I hope be a lot of learning going on. We may have to do another one if we exceed capacity, so that's a good problem to have. Let me go ahead, and for those of you that are not familiar with an RRAP, DHS sponsors the Regional Resiliency Assessment Program called RRAP. It's a cooperative assessment of specific critical infrastructure with input and guidance from state and federal local partners, including the private sector. It looks at a specific geographical area and provides regional analysis of interdependencies and surrounding infrastructure that really identify a range of issues that they can work on together regionally and nationally. And they pick topics to focus on that could have regional or national implications. The RRAP report identifies gaps, produces tools and best practice recommendations. Should be a great webinar today and a great report coming up. So with that, I'd like to invite John Durkin, the Regional Director at U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office of Infrastructure Protection, to provide us opening comments. John?
Thank you, Tom. And good afternoon, everybody. Can you? I'm hoping everybody can hear me. I'm in a government building that has little challenges on outside phone calls. So, like Tom indicated, the Regional Resiliency Assessment Program is basically DHS working with state and local partners. This was probably the first one where we worked with a non-governmental organization, meaning the EPCOM, which is an HHS-funded coalition, versus going out to a state emergency management or a county utility authority, whether water or public utilities. So we kind of approached this with the attitude that we're not going to go in and say we're from the government, we're here going to tell you what to do. We approach it with, we're here from the government, we want to help you, we have money, we have this project we want to do, but please tell us what's important. I'm not going to belabor this point, I'm going to let Kelly talk, but one of the things that we always talk about in emergency management is unintended consequences. And one of the biggest unintended consequences, which turns out to be extremely positive, was we learned early in the beginning is the amount of pharmaceuticals and all types of medical supplies that are manufactured in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is also in our region. So we had initial contact with our PSA down in Puerto Rico and said, hey, look, when there may come a point in time where we may ask you to reach out to some of the manufacturers down there as we answer and try and look at some supply chain issues. Well, that all changed on September 20th when Maria came barreling into Puerto Rico. I will tell you this, that as a result of starting this RRAP and having Puerto Rico in our region, we were able to immediately coordinate between FEMA, other assets within the government, and some of the private sector medical manufacturers, without mentioning names, and to respect their confidentiality and their business information. But there was quite soon, probably around the 25th, 26th, it became apparent that there was going to be a critical shortage in this country of time-sensitive oncology drugs, particularly the live biologics, which are manufactured in a plant in Puerto Rico. We were able to coordinate and get those things, get them into the States, get them into the mainland, basically the first airport we can get them to, and then let the company take it over from there through their own supply chains. Same thing with a company that manufactures blood bags, the blood collection bags. We did a visit on them, very remote, top of a mountain in the west end of the island. Their generator, they were telling us, had about a day and a half left before it was just going to go kabuts. Had it gone kabuts, they would have lost everything, had to restart and re-sterilize the plant, probably would have set back the whole production and everything about a month. We were able to get the Corps of Engineers to get them a generator that day. The same thing, I will tell you this, if anybody in the healthcare industry thought that there was a IV solution shortage in this country in the winter during flu season, it would have been 5 times as worse if it were not for this RRAP and what we learned and how we were able to work with shippers, customs, and everybody to get
medical gases in from the mainland in onto the island and out to the plants, so that they could generate oxygen, generate nitrogen, to get out to these facilities, particularly the IV solutions, because all of those gases are used in a sterilization project. So you're going to hear a lot of great things about what we learned. These are the things that we didn't intend to learn, but we did learn it, and I think the country is a lot stronger and more resilient because of that. And on that, I will cede to Kelly.
Yeah, thank you, John. As John said, my organization, NYU Langone Health, chairs the Borough Coalition under the Department of Health and Human Services Hospital Preparedness Program, the HPP. So our Borough Coalition includes healthcare, hospitals, and ambulatory care sites, and New York Blood Center, and all of the healthcare providers in the borough of Manhattan. And so we all have the same mission of delivering patient care, and we have a tremendous capability around the issue of supply chain. But this tool that DHS provides, this RRAP tool, is a unique program, and what it does is it leverages the national labs, and you're going to hear from them in a second, to provide a just an off-the-charts data analysis and broad-based analysis of the supply chain, the healthcare supply chain sector. And that is the idea is really to give us insight that we can't get anywhere else. And as this slide shows, really the issue is that, you know, we own the issue of patient care. We rely on these supply chains. If they're disrupted, it disrupts our ability to provide patient care, and so we can't just cede the responsibility for resilience to the suppliers. We have to understand the issue as well as we can, so that we can be as resilient as we can from our end. Because if there is a major disruption, you know, we are going to be the ones that are going to have to shorten those timelines. And the RRAP gives us the insight to be able to do that, to be able to solution some of those issues up front, and to be able to shorten the timelines when there is a disruption. So that is the key points, and I'll turn it back to Tom. I do appreciate everybody's time today, and this really is an introduction. We just want to present to you the project itself, and to get you interested, and just with the understanding that there's a lot of follow-up and a lot more information to come.
Great, thank you, Kelly. We have exceeded our capacity, so we may be doing this again, Kelly. So I guess I'll send an email out to all those that were not able to get in, but we victims of our own success, I guess. Our presenters today, Mohammed and Peter, I'll let them introduce themselves. I'm going to switch screens, Mohammed, so you can take it from there and provide us a demo, okay?
Okay, thank you, Tom. So while we do that, allow me a minute just to introduce myself. My name is Mohammed Talab. I'm a protective security advisor with DHS's Office of Infrastructure Protection here in Region 2. And what we're going to talk about today is the project in greater detail, the participants, and then walk you through the project deliverables. We'll talk a little bit about the report, the supply chain profiles that were developed, the supply chain disruption planning tool that's really meant to help generate thought and spur conversation within planning circles, and the supply chain navigator, which we're calling a tool, which is essentially our ability to operationalize, in a sense, all of the information that I listed above. And then we'll close out with some next steps. So a little bit on DHS Infrastructure Protection Region 2. So first and foremost, you've heard from our regional director, John Durkin, a moment ago, and it is through this office that we work within the region, New York, New Jersey, and the Caribbean, to enhance and further the protection of critical infrastructure within our area of responsibility from both man-made and natural disasters. And we do this via a wide variety of tools. First and foremost are our full suite of physical security assessments, which our partners on the call may avail themselves to, and I've listed our contact information at the bottom of this slide. And through our partnerships with the DHS Office of Cybersecurity and Communication, we're also able to provide a wide variety of cybersecurity tools, all of which are at no cost and provided without any regulatory bent whatsoever, so completely voluntary. Kelly had discussed, the Regional Resiliency Assessment Program, so I won't spend too much time there, but I will say that the lessons we learned from this study help us inform decisions that are made in support of emergency management activities and emergency response activities, which is that, while we're recording what those dependencies are on paper and we're developing all of these tools, it's our goal really to walk back and inform the department writ large as to what some of those nuances are of in this case, the supply chain, or in another case is the dependency of infrastructure. And then lastly, the wide variety of training activities. And, I feel that it's necessary, even though we're here to talk about, supply chain, and we're going to do so in great detail here in a moment, the opportunities for active shooter preparedness training, counter IED training, and all of those sorts of things that emergency managers, supply chain directors, and executives need to continually concern themselves with. And so we really try to be holistic in our approach and our engagement with critical infrastructure. We strive to do so in partnership with the state and local authorities that are within our jurisdictions, and in many times provide the support through those agencies. And so with that, again, I'll just point you to the email address that's located at the bottom there, ipregion2ops@hq.dhs.gov. We welcome the opportunity to have much more detailed conversation with any one of you in any of these areas that I just described.
Yeah. Hi, folks. This is Peter Fitzmaurice. I'm going to now walk through the project in a little more detail. I'm with Idaho National Laboratory, working closely with the RAP team over the past year or so on this project. We've already talked about the RAP program, so we'll kind of skip ahead here and really get into the nuts and bolts of what we did and what came of it. And I will tell you, I'm going to try to go through it at a pretty good clip just to kind of keep the things moving along here. But please, if there are any key questions, we can either take that as we go, or maybe even better, please feel free to send them on to us with some of our contact information. We can certainly get back to you on more detailed questions. But just to get into it, Kelly McKinney had mentioned this whole project really started with the EPCOM coalition here in Manhattan, desiring, as we talked about, a much better sense for the healthcare supply chains that underpin healthcare delivery throughout the New York City and the broader region. It was a pretty broad starting point. It took a lot of scoping at the outset to understand what exactly we wanted to do. But what everyone knew is that there needed to be greater understanding, greater detailed a sense of the movement of products, their origin points, greatest points of concern. What could potentially happen that's beyond the norm that either New York City or other metropolitan areas in the country have experienced in the past. So those were some of the key sort of drivers as we got into the project. Just a quick point on the scope. Geographically, no doubt New York City, the 5 boroughs, was a real key focus, but we very definitely pulled in northern New Jersey, northern counties of New York and Long Island, to sort of look at the broader metropolitan area as sort of the core geographic focus area. But then obviously we very quickly moved beyond that. When you talk about supply chain, the movement of these products, we got very regional, national, and certainly international. So certainly didn't travel internationally, but had some very good conversations with international global companies that really lie at the core of some of these supply chains. So just to give you a feel, the geographic focus, the core of it was the New York metro area, but very quickly sort of moved beyond that in terms of the key stakeholders involved. In terms of the products, that's obviously a very key question when we say supply chains for what? Early on, there were questions whether we wanted to focus on very specific, particular products. What we found out is that probably was not going to be practical or useful. And what we all decided on, working closely with the healthcare providers and the vendor community and some of the government agencies, is there are really 5 key buckets of products that made sense to focus on. So as you can see on the slide, there are pharmaceuticals, medical surgical products, certainly a very large category of products, but unique unto themselves in terms of how that supply chain works. Gases, so not just oxygen, but some of the other medical gases, although oxygen was a key focus. Blood and blood products, and healthcare linens. That was not a category we initially focused on, but it was emphasized pretty strongly at the outset that linens are a very distinct supply chain and play a key role and really ought to be looked at as well. So just to give you a feel, those are the 5 sort of industries or product categories that we focused in on. We certainly recognize there are others as well, and some service-based healthcare supply chains that also come into play here, but those 5 were sort of for the current project the main focus. And then lastly, all hazards. It really was sort of an all hazards look. From the New York standpoint, obviously a lot of focus on coastal storms and flooding, but we very purposely looked much more broadly and looked at really the full range of what could possibly disrupt supply chains, even into the IT realm, global conflicts, things of that sort. So that's a quick kind of overview on the project scope. The slide you see here, it's a little hard to read, perhaps, very detailed, but we wanted everyone to appreciate the very broad-based participation that occurred. I think it's fair to say that there was few, if any, organizations that were not willing to step up and to discuss supply chain. And luckily for us, what I would say that really the key players in these 5 product categories that we just walked through for the New York metro area all were very cooperative, very interested to talk, and very interested in sharing their insights. So just wanted everyone to get a feel for it. You see a lot of the key government agencies from the federal, state, and city municipal level into New Jersey as well. Certainly healthcare coalitions are very key. Almost all major healthcare systems in the New York metro area we visited with and talked with and interviewed. Other non-acute care healthcare providers, and that's going to come out in a moment as we walk through some of the key findings and key themes. So not just acute care, hospital settings. Then obviously logistics, distributors, vendors across those 5 product categories. And again, you know, each one of those were about 3 to 5 major players that we turned to really get a good sense for things. And all of those organizations participated. And then lastly, that last column, the GPO perspective, obviously pretty key. Supply chain data companies, and then lastly, a lot of industry associations that play a very key role in this. I'm going to call out the Greater New York Hospital Association was a very key partner from the outset, continues to be, but some of the others as well. Some of the pharmaceutical and med-surg healthcare industry associations were key as well. And then lastly, before I move on, I want to mention Department of Health and Human Services, ASPR. Also was a very key partner from the outset. They also, they may be on the line today, are also very interested in supply chain issues. So just wanted to call them out as well. Very key participant throughout the project. So let me just get into kind of what came of it. The 6 items you see along the side there, those are really, I'll call them the 6 major themes. You know, as we did the interviews, probably on the scale of 60, 70 organizations, probably over 100 distinct interviews, several follow-ups. A lot of the key issues and themes kept repeating themselves when we raised the issue of supply chain for medical products in the New York City area. So let me just walk through what those are pretty quickly. The report, the final report, it's sort of in its final stages of being pulled together, obviously walks through these in much more detail, gets into them in much more detail. But just to give you a feel and a flavor for where we came in on with the project, the first 2 key themes are really primarily about education and understanding. Even before you get into disruptions to the supply chains, there was a real focus on the need to better understand the steady state business operations. Who are the key players in these supply chains? You know, what are their time factors? What are some of the just-in-time delivery mechanisms? You know, how do the hospitals order products? What are the IT systems they depend and rely upon? How do they communicate with vendors? All of those issues, again, we call them the business realities of how this works. A lot of recognition that there needs to be better understanding across all all stakeholders, whether it's at the government level, the healthcare provider level, the vendor level. So that, in a nutshell, really was the first driving theme. But there's a lot to be learned and a lot that will translate into the disaster setting. If you have a more solid understanding, probably a much better position to address a major disruption. Secondly, the diversity of healthcare. A lot of emphasis on the need to focus, of course, beyond just acute care and hospital settings. The movement of healthcare to sort of outside the hospital is key. We met with some retail pharmacy organizations, home healthcare groups, outpatient facilities, really the need to understand how supply chains are different for those different types of healthcare settings. So that was the key idea behind the second theme. 3 and 4 are really about the risk environment. The third point there was really about understanding that while perhaps not seen too often, there are supply chain disruption scenarios that go beyond probably what a lot of folks think about and quite honestly talk to us about throughout the interviews. So we wanted to get beyond sort of the flooding or the traffic accident type of disruption and really better understand the much broader supply chain risk landscape, I'll call it. So that was a key theme on number 3, is the need to really focus in more detail on that. Fourthly is the visibility up and down supply chains. This really was probably one of the absolute key issues raised most often, was the concern about visibility up and down the supply chain depending on where you lie. So for healthcare providers, what's happening 2 or 3 notches up. For healthcare vendors, what's happening at the manufacturing base, and then for manufacturers, what's happening with their key product input providers, and what that means in terms of supply chain disruption planning. And then lastly, the last 2 key themes are about sort of with all of that understanding, how do we plan, how do we cooperate, how do we work across organizations to incorporate that understanding into better plans, mechanisms, joint approaches to these types of challenges. So it's really about the healthcare coalition structure, for example, the help among different healthcare systems working together from their supply chain perspective. And then the last point, really honing in on the governmental piece. Again, the final report gets into this in more detail, but that kind of gives you a flavor for what these themes were, what the major concern areas were, and obviously we recognize each one of those are pretty in-depth study unto themselves. But hopefully that gives you a sense for where the report's focus areas are. So a lot of text here. I'm not going to go through this, but we didn't just identify the key themes, but in talking to all the different stakeholders, the question was, well, what do we do about these issues? What do we do about obtaining a better understanding across different stakeholder bases? What do we do about the risk environment? How do we better understand it? How do we cooperate better? So we focus on that as well. So for each one of those 6 key themes, we have probably something like 4 to 5 what we call enhancement options, resilience enhancement options. They're not obviously prescriptive. They really came from all the project participants with sort of what they viewed to be the best next steps. So this just gives you a flavor, for example, sort of the ability to develop better resources for understanding the supply chain. I mean, can we put together almost a portfolio of documents or decision support tools to help us better understand how the supply chains work? On the issue of the healthcare diversity, I think there was a lot of recognition we need to better pull in some of these other healthcare providers that maybe fall off the radar screen a bit. So, residential care facilities such as that, how do we pull them in and cooperate better on some of these topics and issues? So those were some of the recommendations on the second issue there. On the risk issue, how do we think bigger about healthcare disruption scenarios? Where can we find help to sort of better incorporate that into our planning, whether a healthcare provider or government agency? So we touch on sort of ideas about how to better look at scenarios, think about the broader risk environment. A few other supply chain visibility. I think a key outcome there was a desire to better get at some of this supply chain disruption information. I'll say intelligence. It may not be the best term, but most project participants absolutely acknowledge that they would like more information about what's happening up that hazy supply chain. So one issue coming out of that is the ability to hopefully work with some of the stakeholders on identifying information requirements. Because what we saw is that a lot of organizations said they would like more, but they didn't initially know exactly what they needed. So is it information about particular vendors, about particular global regions where products are being sourced from? So I think we have a lot of work to do there, but that's one of the jumping off points for that issue. And then lastly, drills, exercises, some of the ESFH structures in and around the city. You know, how are those formulated, structured? You know, are there areas for improvement there? So that was just a quick run through some of the follow-up to the key themes, but we have a whole list of these proposed next steps that are in the final report that we look forward to sharing with folks, and really having some of those serve as a basis for next steps as we move on from the first phase of the project here. So let me get into some of the associated products that go along with the narrative. So as you can see, those 6 themes, very, very high level, kind of almost like the grand challenges for healthcare supply chains. But the interviews, a lot of the information gathered really provided a much more detailed look at each one of those 5 product categories. So what we developed in conjunction with the final report is what we're calling supply chain profiles for those 5 categories for pharmaceuticals, blood, gases, the others. And let me just for a moment here pull up one of them just to give you a feel for what are in these. Each one is about you know, 7 to 8 pages. The one you see here is for blood products. Really, what we do is sorry about that, is lay out sort of what the supply chain is, how it's structured. Sorry, I'm struggling a bit with the screen here. One moment. There we go. Sorry. So as you can see here, you know, we lay out in somewhat of a simplified way the supply chain for blood products. Again, this is specific to New York City. What are the touch points for the manufacturing of supporting products? John Durkin touched on blood bags and the criticality of blood bags as part of the supply chain. Obviously, the blood themselves, blood collection points. And what we do in each one of these supply chain profiles is walk through each one of those stages of the supply chain. So the first one, blood collection, very high level, try to keep it as simple as possible. Under each one of those, what are some of the risk considerations for that step in the supply chain? You scroll down to blood testing. You know, where are the testing facilities? Do they have backups? You know, are you relying on a testing facility in another region? Do you have contracts with closer in blood testing facilities? Those types of considerations that we think are pretty key to thinking about these different topics. And then I'll just scroll down all the way down to the endpoint. So the healthcare provider, the healthcare customer, sort of how are they approaching this particular supply chain on blood? Do they have backup vendors? You know, what happens if the last mile delivery for blood products is disrupted? So what we tried to capture some of the main considerations that different stakeholders should be perhaps factoring into their planning if they're not already. So that's just the blood example. Again, we have one for each one of the 5 product supply chains that we looked at. And we're hoping those are helpful resources, kind of a starting point to think through some of these issues. So in addition to the profiles, we did some, I'll call it traditional mapping, some traditional GIS work here. There's probably something like 12 to 13 maps that we developed. And as folks on the line know, it's one thing to map power plants or water treatment plants with information that's readily available. It can be a little more trickier when you're trying to identify some of the healthcare product warehouses, linen processing plants in and around the city, some of the blood manufacturing sites. That's really what we wanted to do. These are just a few screenshots, but you know, as we're getting into these themes, obviously a critical theme is where are these critical facilities within these supply chains? You know, are they local? Are they regional? You know, to what extent are we relying on a daily basis on facilities that lie outside the region? So that was the purpose here, was to plot out, again, across those 5 categories. So, you know, medical, surgical, pharmaceutical, distribution warehouses, blood manufacturing facilities, blood testing facilities, linen processing, oxygen productions, air separation plants, and cylinder filling sites, and the like. So that's what we tried to do, is map those out, again, to get a feel, to get an understanding for supply chain, for movements. We didn't go much beyond that. We didn't want to get into terribly sensitive information. It's really just a high-level plotting of some of these key locations, key facilities. So that's another element to the report. Moving on, it's a little hard to see. I'm going to pull up a different version of this, but I've touched a bit on scenarios. And the need to perhaps think beyond the norm when it comes to supply chain disruptions. We heard this time and again throughout the project. So what we went ahead and did is pull together a bit of a resource to think about supply chain disruption scenarios. Hopefully you can see this. It's essentially a spreadsheet. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward resource, But what we did is sort of provide an opportunity for whether it's a coalition or a healthcare provider, a government agency, a tabletop exercise group, to really deconstruct supply chain disruption scenarios. So you'll see we sort of classify different scenarios into root causes. What's the source of a disruption? Is it manufacturing? Is it distribution? Is it product demand? Is it a combined factors? And then walking across sort of probability and likelihood issues, impact of disruptions, duration and severity issues, the ability to factor in the extent to which only a given sector or subsector within healthcare is affected. And then, of course, getting into sort of resolution issues. So is there likely to be pre-event planning for this type of scenario, or is it sort of unheard of and therefore very few plans are on the books? What types of actions are most likely need to be taken, and a few other categories there. So just wanted you to see, this is something, again, that we hope is helpful. What we went ahead and did is filled in a variety of sort of example scenarios. So we looked at ones that are probably very large scale. So, a U.S. plant, sole source for a particular product goes down. What does that mean? Maybe it doesn't mean a lot because there could be redundant other facilities. But if, the second example there is a catastrophic typhoon in Southeast Asia that wipes out a large production region for med-surg items. Well, that means something very different. So again, this will be products, but we just want to feel the diligence in it. And really, again, the idea here is thinking piece to more break down the types of scenarios, concerns that sort of at play, throughout this topic area. And then lastly, let me just touch on kind of gone through thus far is a lot of paper-based products, admittedly, a lot of information down on paper, a lot of separate supply chain profiles. It really seemed to make sense to us, and I'll pull up probably a better version of this, that we wanted to pull everything together sort of on a single screen, if you will. I will say this is sort of a version 1.0. At this stage, it made sense, though, to pull up the supply chains across the board, across those 5 categories, think about them geographically. So as you see sort of across from left to right, the international, national, all the way down to the last mile perspective for these 5 different product categories. What some of those major points along the way are, from distribution, manufacturing, all the way back to the suppliers of product inputs for blood bags, for pharmaceuticals, for linens. I mean, with the linen companies, we spoke a lot about cotton growing and disruptions to the production of cotton in some of the source countries. So the idea here at this point is really to provide a platform to sort of walk through, really almost in an educational way, click on a given supply chain, pharmaceuticals, get into a little more detail about how the supply chain works, how it's constructed, the ability to click through on different elements. So, distribution hubs, what are distribution hubs for pharmaceuticals? Where are they located? What jobs do they have within the supply chain? And just like with the individual profiles, we have embedded in here some of the supply chain risk considerations. So that just gives you sort of a flavor for how we tried to pull all this together into sort of a bit of a visualization tool. But what I'll say is, as we got into this more and more, you can very readily see the ability to move this beyond an educational or training piece into something that's much more operational. So I think that's where we'd like to take this next, and we're hoping to have some follow-up interaction with a lot of the project participants on how this could become more operational. So if you can imagine a given healthcare system or a given agency, a given coalition could take something like this and almost make it their own. So they could embed some of those scenarios along these supply chains. They could embed more specific information about who their vendors are, who their third-party logistics providers are, who some of their backups are. They could even potentially hang business continuity plans at the appropriate locations throughout the supply chains, things of that sort. So that would really be the next step. We wanted to do something, pretty straightforward and simple to grasp at the outset, but I think that the point now is sort of what would be the next step in terms of making this, again, more operational for the folks here in New York City, and obviously this could be applicable much beyond them. So just wanted to let you have a look at and look for input as we go talk a little bit about sort of where we go from here. One moment. So as I mentioned, everything's still pretty much in draft form, although we've had a very thorough review process, and I think that's pretty key. So all those major vendors that we noted have looked at everything, have had the ability to make some corrections. So we're pretty confident what we're reflecting here in terms of how these supply chains are constructed is accurate, is really laying out the challenges correctly. So we're wrapping up that review phase, and again, probably by the beginning of June, pretty much all these elements will be finished, complete, and really ready to distribute to the folks that participated. And we're looking forward to also sharing it more widely as well and figuring out the best way to do that. So following up on the issuance of the deliverables will be an event here in Manhattan on June 7 to sort of pull everyone together. We had a few opportunities to do that throughout, but for the most part, it was a lot of one-on-one interaction. So in early June, we're going to do our best to pull all the different stakeholders together and have a sort of a TTX/workshop to take some of these elements and to drive into them a bit more, maybe throw out a few scenarios and talk about this in more detail, both private and public sector participants, to really get into the nitty-gritty a bit more. Last couple of items. As I mentioned, there's a whole range of implementation steps and next steps that we've identified in the report. Some of them are already starting to move forward. We'd like to really hone in on ones that are going to really rise to the top that make sense for a lot of the key stakeholders. So that'll be a next step too during the summer, is which one of those next steps probably are most ripe for moving forward. And again, those will be laid out in the key report that folks can see there. The last thing I'll mention is through this RAP program, you folks heard a lot about it at the outset. Each year, there's a whole new sort of tranche of projects that are approved, about 10 to 12 each year at DHS headquarters. We have gotten approval to continue this healthcare focus, which is very exciting. As you can see here, it's going to be a much more focused project, but still in the same vein. But throughout this current project, a lot of emphasis was placed on critical, time-sensitive, temperature-sensitive, cold chain materials and products, obviously primarily in the pharma and blood realms. But there was so much emphasis on that everyone agreed that would be an interesting follow-up topic to drill down a bit more. So we're marching forward with that project. We really look forward to pulling participants together. If some of the folks on the line were not involved in the first one, we look forward to having you involved in the second one if it makes sense for this topic area. We just wanted to mention that we're at the very earliest stages, but that should be a very interesting topic area with a lot of very critical issues to examine when it comes to aviation and very sensitive products making their way into New York City for healthcare purposes. So much more to come on that. That's sort of the quick run through. Again, moved pretty fast, but that's the gist of the project. It was about a year-long effort. It's not over yet. We're wrapping up the deliverables, but everything we've touched on here, we look forward to them continuing. And the folks up here in Region 2, I know are really building on a lot of these partnerships. I think that's one of the key outcomes, is some very important partnerships I think have been established on healthcare that maybe we're not as strong in the past. It's really been a key effort, a key opportunity to really delve much more into healthcare. So I think in that sense, it's been a real good success.
Thank you, Peter. Phenomenal job. So I'd like to turn it back over to you, Tom, and maybe we could take some questions in the chat if time allows, and provide some information on how folks might be able to reach back out to us.
Sure. I wanted to make sure we touched on next actions real quick. So the number of questions on the report coming out, I think, Mohammed, we mentioned June 2018, the report will be out. So that was one piece. And look for a second webinar as a follow-on to this as we go forward. I think there'll be some activities that come out of that, and there may be another webinar sometime in the June-July timeframe. So we do have questions. We have one question so far from Carla Gammon, and her question is this: as you map out the sources of various suppliers, are we also going to be able to see secondary suppliers in the same area? to see if they are also affected? Great question. One of you panelists want to address that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So for the most part, to the extent we were identifying sort of specific locations, I would say it was primarily focused on the immediate region. So what we did not do very purposely is try to map specific origin points, I will say. So the manufacturing of different pharmaceuticals and medical surgical products. What we did do is really try to identify the distribution points that are most key for some of these major transportation and distribution vendors. But a caveat to that, and something I would absolutely be remiss if I didn't mention it, is while we may have identified, and this is all working closely with the companies themselves and confirming sort of where their facilities are and the roles that those facilities play, you know, for med-surg or pharma, if there's 3 or 4 big distributors, we readily recognize that there may be 30 or 40 other types of distributors that, while they may not be moving the same volume, they can play a very critical role. They might even be moving products that some of the major distributors are not moving. So I just wanted to mention that our mapping to date really focuses on the big national players, but the maps are highly caveated. And I think those caveats are critical because, somewhat to your point, there's a lot more than meets the eye in terms of the folks we spoke with. So I just wanted to make that point clear. But again, just to be clear, we didn't trace products per se. There was some discussion of that at the outset, but I think we recognized that would be a bridge too far and probably much too complex for this immediate project. I don't know if that answers the question, but
okay. Anyone else? The next question is from Byron Calais. Says, to clarify, in the next project, a deeper dive for the product lines of the first project, or will the second project examine other product lines?
Yeah, Tom, thanks for the question. So, I think that the second project is looking at a very specific subset of either primarily pharmaceutical products, those that are incredibly time sensitive, that may require certain, infrastructure components to sustain temperature control. And so while we might be introducing, cold chain and sort of the aspects of that time-sensitive supply chain as a new topic, it's certainly, I think, nested within much of what we've discussed already in the previous project.
Very good. Any other comments? Very good. The next question is from Greg Adams. How does a large Fortune 10 example, healthcare, pharma, prescription managing corporation, benefit from this reporting and analysis? And the second part of that is, how can such a company take advantage of the reporting and analysis? Great question. Thank you, Greg.
Hey, Tom, it's Kelly.
Go ahead, Kelly.
So that is a great question. That is the question, I think. And for me, it really, so we're the emergency managers here, and it's always helpful to look at worst case scenario. So what is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is we have a major disruption to one of our critical sources of supply, and it's impacting our patient care. So what happens then? Well, the first thing that happens is problem identification. You have to understand what the disruption is and what the source of the disruption is, and I think in most cases that information is going to be in this report. So you'll have that at hand. Now, so the question that really begs the question, well, then why don't I go and look at the report and understand these kinds of disruptions beforehand and prepare for them? And that's the idea. So this tabletop exercise, actually it's a functional exercise we're having on June 7th. We're going to do that. We're going to lay a scenario out, and we're going to have the key players, both from the supply side and from the demand side, at the table, and we're going to walk through a pretty significant scenario, and through that, the questions are, how can we best prepare to manage this should it occur. And so, what does it mean? Does it mean that we identify alternative sources of supply, or that we identify alternative methods of patient care? You know, in the worst instance, or does it mean that you know, in some cases we're going to push critical issues up? And one of the things that I think Peter pointed out and Mohammed pointed out was, ultimately, if we have a national level disruption to a critical source of supply, that's quickly going to become a government issue, right? And so, if we can identify some of those, you know, very vulnerable potential disruptions and put them into the government sector now for them to start to plan for, you know, we maybe could improve the outcomes on the back end. So the short answer is, the report contains information that we can use to prepare, both through our tabletop exercises and also to inform our own supply chain management folks so they understand it. And that way, when the worst occurs, we're going to be, you know, we're going to have a leg up. We're going to know where to start.
Yeah. Tom, this is Peter. Kelly, agree completely. One other point, I think, on the sort of the question of some of the large companies and the sort of expert supply chain organizations out there, I think the report also definitely was intended to acknowledge what these companies are already capable of in terms of supply chain resilience. So just so folks understand, it wasn't just about necessarily the gaps and what's wrong. So much of the learning that occurred was to better understanding the resilience that's already in place with a lot of these major companies and some of the smaller ones too. So there was a lot of discussion throughout about redundancy of facilities. So another one of the caveats that you would see on our maps is that while we identify specific facilities, there are as folks on the phone know, there are national networks of these distribution facilities that there really, in many ways, is not necessarily a single point of failure. There's a lot of, obviously, backup plans, so much discussion about stocking up in the event of a pre-warning for large coastal storms, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to mention, I think part of the benefit for those larger participants in the project was to be able to communicate what they've already invested in supply chain resiliency, and that's reflected in the report as well. So I just wanted to make that point.
And I have a follow-up to that, and it's really acknowledging what Peter said. But I think from a healthcare side, I think it's important to understand the asymmetries of information. Okay, there is an asymmetric distribution of critical information with this issue, and what I mean by that is this: there's a commercial relationship that we have with our vendors. And those vendors are incentivized to communicate to us all of the ways that they're resilient and minimize any discussion that they could potentially not deliver what we expect from them. And so you know, if we had a vendor that told us all the things they worried about and all the potential sources of failure, you know, that's the vendor that you're not going to retain because you don't have confidence in them. So, and I'm not saying anybody's hiding anything. I'm just saying that vendor is incentivized to minimize these issues in front of us, and not to show us that if these disruptions occur, in many cases they're just going to throw up their hands and they're going to say, I don't know what to tell you. I don't have a supplier. That's it. You know, I'm just going to wait until my supplier gives it to me, and then we're going to be stuck, right? So those asymmetries of information are mitigated with this report. So you'll up front understand much more clearly where those landmines are, and I think that's important for us. It's almost like an informed consumer. You know, we're a much more informed consumer with these issues, and we need to be, because they're so important to you know, our continuity of operations.
Very good. Any other comments? Good. Next question is from Abraham Gunn. We found during response operations in Puerto Rico that the visibility, flow, and accuracy of information and business rules for communication were a critical shortfall in the medical gas sector. Understanding supply chain up and down can only do so much if you cannot communicate to mitigate any disruptions. Can we address this shortfall as well?
Let me pause for a moment, see if John Durkin's on the line. And
hey, Mo, I am. I'm trying to digest this question. So, insofar as the medical gas situation in Puerto Rico, again, and everybody out there has to appreciate the fact that I have to respect respect. It's not, privacy is not the word, but just respect the corporations and the manufacturers and the private sector entities we deal with. There are two manufacturers of medical gas, two main manufacturers of medical gas on the island. Neither of them had power. So that the power issue in Puerto Rico is a total different story, and that was the cause of why these plants, from my understanding and my experience and having been down there, no power or no power, not enough power to manufacture. So what we had to do was bring in ISO tanks of oxygen, nitrogen, argon, and a few others. And in this case, we were actually prioritizing in Jacksonville. So the way commodities get into Puerto Rico, if you're not familiar, is they're barged in through the port of Jacksonville from Pensacola, New Jersey, and some other ports. We pretty much had this operation we knew when the companies had we're expecting an ISO shipment. We tracked it to the port of Jacksonville. We coordinated with the shippers. It was last on in Jacksonville and first off in Puerto Rico, and then we got it out to the factories, to the plants. And these two plants work together. When I, up until they got back online, it was what's best for Puerto Rico. The cooperation. It was what's best for the island. What's best for the people on the island. So the reality with this is, and like most of the other plants, it was power and the PREPA issue. If you want, I don't want to go down the road of the issue of power and PREPA, but if you read the news today, even last week, 900,000 people lost power. It is a very, very fragile electrical system, very, very fragile grid. So I hope that answers the question. I'll stay in line if whoever asked it has follow-ups.
The question was, go ahead, a comment?
No, Tom, it's Kelly. I mean, the question is a great question. The communication and coordination is going to solve a problem in the moment, right? And so is the result of this study, are the outcomes of this study going to improve that? And I think the answer in my mind is an unequivocal yes, and for two reasons. One is because if you look at that supply chain navigator that Peter and his team put together, you see all of the links in the chain. And not only do we know where what the links in the chain are, we know who the links in the chain are, and that's the goal. That's the roadmap. So when you understand where the disruption is, what link in the chain is the disruptor, and you have a phone number for that individual. And I'm not saying that with this report we're going to have every link in every chain in the healthcare supply chain, but we're going to have a much better idea of where they are and who they are. And in fact, John told me the story about how that happened in Puerto Rico. As a benefit of this study, they actually knew many of the players, and so we're able to shorten those timelines. So that's the issue. Once the disruption occurs, you really have to get all the stakeholders involved in the problem, in a conversation, put the problem on the table, and solve it. And so I think this, especially with the supply chain navigator, I think it's really going to help us to shorten the timeline to be able to do that.
Yeah, and this is Mohammed here. Just one brief comment. I think one of the key findings that recognizes the importance of ESF8 and those structures to sort of work through those communications as they exist. So the report recognizes it, and as John and Kelly just mentioned, there was some real practical experiences associated with the importance of being able to have that response type communication.
Kelly, follow-up question here from Abraham Gunn again. How do we better integrate companies such as Prax Air and Linde to make response more successful? I think this speaks to the whole private-public integration here. You want to address that?
Yeah, well, Tom, I think you're in the forefront of that, right? Through the All Hazards Consortium, is the government, the not-for-profit sectors, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector are silos, and they don't understand each other that well, and they're not used to working together well. So I think organizations like the All Hazards Consortium is really working on that. Especially, this is the example. This is the greatest example, I think, of that. But I do also look forward to a series of key discussions at this functional exercise in June. We're going to have those key vendors at the table, and at a very high level, right? And so and that's the key. If you have the high level folks involved, if there's an impact anywhere in their organization, we can reach them. And so I think through a series of those kinds of discussions, we're going to understand the best process for that across the whole sector, or at least across a good measure of it. Because the thing about the analysis itself is it's showing us where to focus our efforts. Where are the most critical vulnerabilities, right? I don't think you have to shore up every link in every chain, but Puerto Rico was a great example. Puerto Rico showed us, hey, there's a weak link in the supply chain that we, maybe could have done something about in advance.
Hey, Tom, John, if I could add, I mean, the thing with Puerto Rico is you have to understand that the fact that we're separated by an ocean, and to get back to the communications piece, and this is a lesson learned from having, endured the storm from as far back as Irma, is FEMA's private National Business Emergency Operations Center. I would highly recommend people get involved with that too, because as we were having our daily conference calls, they also opened a chat line, and you saw private sector, business to business, folks just linking up on the chat lines and taking the chats offline and solving solutions. Because I'm going to be honest, the government's good at certain things, and the private sector is good at others, and we can aid you and coordinate you, but the private sector does a heck of a job, much better job of getting back into line than the government does. That's just my personal thoughts.
Very good. Next question is from David. And David, forgive me if I mispronounce your last name, Polaneski. Sorry, David. Last mile is very difficult for nursing homes. Most pharmaceuticals are repackaged locally or locally for PTs. Is this being addressed?
Yeah, this is Peter. Let me just say at a high level, we very definitely tried to acknowledge, I think, that the issue that you're getting at. We didn't get into the nuts and bolts of particular types of facilities and some of their very unique challenges. But I think generally, if you remember that second key theme, I think is really what you're touching on is beyond the norm. So much of our discussions seem to focus on the big hospital setting and that sort of situation. But I think as we got into it more, at least as a starting point, there was a key acknowledgement that the types of situation you're talking about, so for a nursing home or another type of an independent pharmacy, I think that was another key focus as we spoke to some of the independent pharmacy organizations, sort of their unique needs when it comes to supply chain, and understanding that these are not all one and the same product supply chains. They have very different delivery mechanisms, sometimes even different delivery companies. As you mentioned, a different facet in the supply chain in terms of how the product makes its way there. So I would say at that level, we definitely tried to address the issue of the diversity, I would say, not just in the point of healthcare, but in the patient populations. So we also pay attention to some of the distinct needs for pediatric patient populations when it comes to supply chain, geriatric specialty needs, other types of special populations in terms of understanding that they can have different supply chains, that if you don't understand them at the time of a disruption, you might make some bad assumptions in terms of how you're going to get them back up and running, because there might be totally different companies or even regulatory mechanisms, things of that sort. So I know that's much broader than your question, but I think at that level, we at least sort of crack the thing open and acknowledge that we need to understand the diversity when it comes to supply chains in the region here.
Wonderful. Any other comments? Very good. Are there any other questions? Okay. We've captured all of those. So I don't see any other questions in the panel. Kelly, I'll give you final word, and then we can wrap it up if that's okay.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks, Tom, very much for bringing everybody together with this. I think it was very well done. I appreciate everybody's time, and again, I just want to acknowledge the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and this RRAP program, and Peter and Mohammed and John, and the work has really been important for New York City, for this region, for this sector. I think the difficulty, and anybody that's listened today knows it well, the difficulty is how to take this very complex, highly technical topic and break it down into actionable bites. And Tom, I think you did a good job of getting us closer to that, but I don't think we're quite there. I don't think that it's quite actionable and discernible enough. But I think that the process that we're embarking upon with these functional exercises and the tools is really going to help. Because we are so with the models that we have, and these the way all of our critical supplies are delivered on the day that we need them. We need to be able to move quickly should there be a disruption, and I think this is really going to help us to be able to do that. So I want to thank everybody, and that's it for me. Tom, back to you.
Okay, good. I want to thank all of your participants here that were able to get in. The good news is I'll have an email going out shortly. We had almost as many people register in the last 30 minutes as we planned for. So we'll talk with the team about how to do it. We will record, edit, and send out the recording of this along with the slide deck. Obviously, Kelly and crew, an important topic. So I want to thank you all for attending, and this concludes the webinar. Thank you.